So the question is, can fasting save your life? Modern humans evolved in an environment very different than the one we live in today. It was an environment of scarcity. And in order for our genes to survive, they had to ensure that our brains directed our bodies to get enough to eat and to avoid being eaten long enough that we could reproduce. When the body engages in behaviors that favor survival and reproduction, including eating and sex, the brain rewards the body with the release of dopamine. Dopamine is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. The more dopamine, the more intense the pleasure. And for 200,000 years of modern human existence, this drive for pleasure helped to ensure that humans got enough to eat and successfully reproduced. The system worked because it was very difficult to get enough to eat prior to the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. And humans struggled to do so, and they rarely got too much. Human beings survived and thrived through innovation that was driven by the relentless search for increased pleasure. We even discovered how to artificially enhance the release of dopamine with chemicals like alcohol and drugs. And during the Industrial Revolution, we began to transform our diets from whole natural foods to ultra-processed foods. This dramatically increased the caloric density of food and the pleasure of eating. And thanks to the addition of increasing amounts of salt, oil, and sugar, this salt, oil, and sugar that we've added to the food makes processed foods taste better than whole foods because the consumption results in greatly increased release of dopamine, and this creates what we call a pleasure trap. This enhanced food is unnaturally and intensely more appealing. It makes whole foods less appealing by comparison, to the point of overriding our natural satiety mechanisms. And as we've learned this morning, some people are more vulnerable than others based on their genetics. The increasing use of ultra-processed foods saturated with salt, oil, and sugar has resulted in an epidemic rise in the incidence of obesity. Modern humans have transformed their bodies, dramatically increasing the amount of fat in general and visceral fat in particular. And now visceral fat is the fat that's found predominantly around the abdominal organs. And it's hypertrophic, it's hyperplastic, and it's hypermetabolic. It functions just like a tumor. And its rise is correlated with the epidemic that we see of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and cancer. Here's a map of the United States, and it's depicting the self-reported levels of obesity, with 35% obesity saturation on average on the western part of the United States and 45% on the eastern part. And these actually underreport obesity by as much as 40% as they are self-reported. And it turns out people lie. And they always lie claiming that they're thinner than they are, and they never lie claiming that they're fatter than they are. There's only one place in the entire United States that has a self-reported obesity saturation less than 25%, and that happens to be Washington, D.C., which is the home of our politicians, including President Donald Trump. And that means that the people that live in Washington, D.C. are either the smallest overeaters or the biggest liars. Once caught in the dietary pleasure trap, it's extremely unlikely that anybody will ever escape. Like drug addicts and alcoholics that fail recovery programs over 90% of the time, the likelihood of an individual with a BMI over 40 successfully achieving and maintaining a healthy weight is less than 1%. That means 99% of people using available weight loss strategies will fail, because these strategies involve attempting to eat smaller amounts of hyperpalatable foods. And that's similar to asking alcoholics to treat their alcoholism by drinking less or just drinking beer or wine. For 200,000 years of modern human existence, people ate whole, natural foods. And for just 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, we've been switching to eating ultra-processed foods. If you look carefully at this picture, you may be able to tell what the differences are. The result is that we squander our financial resources by treating the leading causes of death, which are heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, rather than dealing with the actual causes of these conditions, the reason people develop heart disease, diabetes, and cancer in the first place. So if dieting using hyperpalatable foods doesn't work, what does? How can people neuroadapt their taste mechanisms and allow whole foods to become appealing? An ancient practice that's been shown to be safe and effective at helping patients make this transition is called fasting. Fasting is the complete abstinence from all substances except pure water in an environment of rest. And as you can imagine, after eating nothing for days or weeks except water, even the simplest whole fruits and vegetables become quite appealing. In addition to facilitating the switch from hyperpalatable foods to whole foods, fasting preferentially mobilizes visceral fat and reverses many diseases of dietary excess, including high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and lymphoma. These leading causes of death and disability are often treated as independent and unrelated conditions. If you think about it, you have to go to a different kind of doctor to even be diagnosed, let alone treated. However, each of these different classes of conditions is intimately associated with how fat you are, and particularly how much visceral fat you maintain on the body. The key biological adaptation to fasting involves the conversion of our biggest burner of glucose, which is our brain, to burning fat instead of glucose. The brain literally changes fuels. And this adaptation allows human beings to go without eating for up to 70 days before entering starvation. Researchers at the TrueNorth Health Foundation have completed a comprehensive fasting safety study that was published in 2018, demonstrating that fasting can be done safely. This protocol has been used at the TrueNorth Health Center for over 40 years and in over 25,000 patients. In a paper we published in 2021, we documented that fasting around 2 weeks duration, patients lost an average of 9% of their total body weight, but 18% of their total fat, and interestingly, 40% of their visceral fat. Only 6% of lean tissue was lost, and when we followed these patients at 6 weeks, all of the lean tissue was recovered and then some, such that their lean mass percentage was actually higher at follow-up than it was at baseline. But the fat loss continued. Now, fasting's been around for a long time, and I'm suggesting here that the leading causes of death and disability are better treated with fasting than even some of the most accepted medical interventions. So we have to ask, what's going on? What are the mechanisms by which fasting is having these effects? And one most obvious example is weight loss. Patients lose about 1 pound a day in fasting, and as I showed you, the net persistent effect is primarily weight loss, particularly fat loss, particularly visceral fat loss. There's also a powerful natriuretic effect in fasting where the body gets rid of excess sodium. And as the sodium excess is eliminated, so does the blood volume, the fluid volume that goes along that the body's holding to protect itself from the negative effects of excess sodium. So as the blood volume goes down, so does the blood pressure. The congestive heart failure eases, the non-healing wounds start to turn around. People are actually essentially toxic waste dumps. If you actually do a fat biopsy of a person, you'll find there's hundreds of different chemicals, PCB, dioxin, pesticide residues, heavy metals accumulated within the tissues of individuals. Varying degrees with varying individuals, people have different thresholds to these various toxins. And interestingly enough, average of 90% of those toxins got there from the consumption of animal foods. Meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products biologically concentrate materials from the environment and materials that we give them, so that by the time you eat an animal, you got its entire lifetime accumulation of toxic products. A calorie of animal food could have 2 to 1,000 times the concentration of a calorie of plant-based foods. And during fasting, the body rapidly mobilizes and eliminates these accumulated materials. Enzymes are necessary for this to happen, and those detoxifying enzymes, both for toxins but also for macronutrients like fat, are mobilized during fasting. And interestingly enough, it appears those enzyme systems persist, so that you're detoxifying not just when you fast, whether it's 12 hours every night or a longer period of time on an occasional basis, but after you're done fasting, those enzyme systems continue to persist and they accumulate. So every time people fast, they get better and better, not just at fasting, but at mobilizing macronutrients and detoxifying. Insulin, the hormone that drives sugar from the bloodstream into your cells where it functions as your primary fuel, the insulin sensitivity is improved during fasting such that you make better use of your insulin. Diabetes mellitus is essentially not a problem of lack of insulin, but insulin resistance, where the insulin no longer functions properly, and it's caused by the diet that makes you fat. The gut is a tunnel from your mouth to your rectum. When you think about digestion, you're basically shoving stuff in one hole and then eventually trying to push it out the other hole. But it's not actually in your body once you swallow it until it gets absorbed through the intestinal mucosa, which is a very fine mesh that filters out just about everything. Even proteins are too large to absorb through the intestinal mucosa. You have to actually break them down to amino acids to be absorbed, unless something damages the intestinal mucosa. And in our case, it turns out to be free radicals that are a common cause of damaging the intestinal mucosa membrane, which leads to what's called gut leakage. Those tight junctions that are supposed to filter everything become damaged because of oxidative damage. Free radicals come from things like smoking, drinking alcohol. The peroxidation of alcohol yields large amounts of free radicals, why you get fatty liver or cirrhosis of the liver. Also, the use of fats, particularly heated fats and fried foods, bathe the body in free radicals and cause this type of gut leakage. You also have an autonomic nervous system or automatic nervous system, which is profoundly affected by fasting. The autonomic nervous system controls the things you don't think about. For example, if you were to go out running and your heart didn't speed up, you would die. But nobody dies because they forget to tell their heart to speed up. It does it automatically, and it's controlled by the autonomic or automatic nervous system, which has two parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic, that have to stay in balance with each other. If they get out of balance, if the tone of the sympathetic tone, for example, gets too high and the parasympathetic gets too low, you may have symptoms like constipation. Or if the parasympathetic tone is too high, diarrhea, because this autonomic nervous system, amongst its many functions, includes your peristalsis. The most powerful way of rebooting that autonomic nervous system, we've got all these natural therapy systems: chiropractic manipulation, osteopathic manipulation, massage, biofeedback, homeopathy, acupuncture, meditation, yoga, you name it, all these systems. How do they work? Why do they make people feel better? To a large extent, it's because of the effect they have on the autonomic nervous system balance. Some things work better than others in some people and other people. But the most powerful tool I've seen at rebalancing the autonomic nervous system is fasting. The analogy is that it's like taking a computer that's corrupted and you turn it off and you turn it back on and you don't know why, but you flash the hard drive or you flash the memory and now it starts to work again. Fasting works like that in the sense that a lot of things are reboot, not the least of which is the gut microbiome. The immune system is enhanced during fasting, contrary to what might seem intuitively apparent that fasting would produce a hormetic stress and be a problem. The immune system, there's a component called autophagy or autophagy, where the body is able to eat up cancer cells and clear up senescent cells. Autophagy is enhanced through different activities, one of which is fasting. another which is exercise. And interestingly enough, many of the cardiometabolic benefits of exercise are mirrored by fasting. And that's not intuitively obvious. Why would something like fasting, where you're resting, and exercise, where you're very vigorous, have similar effects on cardiometabolic markers? And I think the reason is because both exercise and fasting have one very important thing in common. They both undo the consequences of dietary excess, which is the accumulation of fat and visceral fat that leads to the inflammation that's causing the diseases that are killing people today. Tastes are altered during fasting. We call it taste neuroadaptation. We've actually done a study showing that the actual perception of salt and sweet is changed during fasting. The net result is that good foods start to taste good, and that the ultra-processed, hyper-processed foods become less appealing. And finally, psychospiritual. It's interesting that the Jews and the Jains, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and the Christians don't actually agree on everything. But they do all have a tradition and deep respect for fasting. Now, some biomarkers go up in fasting, and those include things like adenopectin and ghrelin and AMPK. These increases are tied to improved insulin sensitivity and reduced inflammation, as well as increased mitochondrial biogenesis, the actual production of the energy-producing components inside the cell. Beta-hydroxybutyrate becomes, or BHB, becomes the main fuel of the brain when you're fasting. You're not burning glucose predominantly, you're burning this fat. And the increase in BHB is associated with increased production of what's called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's the chemical that prevents the oxidative damage that leads to Alzheimer's disease. Increases in sirtuins also were thought to promote longevity. And that may be why when you do periodic fasting, for example, of rodents, you can as much as double their lifespan with the use of fasting. Some mechanisms also go down in fasting. And those include glucose, insulin, leptin, and IGF-1, or insulin growth factor 1. And simplistically, the lower your IGF-1 is, the longer you're going to live. Blood pressure, heart rate, and mTOR, or mammalian target of rapamycin, also go down in fasting. And we know that the lower your mTOR, the higher your autophagy. So it may be the reduction of mTOR that's responsible for this increased in autophagy. Interestingly enough, Yoshinori Ashumi in 2016 got the Nobel Prize for Medicine, which is pretty recently, for his work on autophagy and how important that process is for us staying alive. For example, it's thought that you're forming cancer cells continuously, and your body's trying to get rid of those cells continuously. And if you get rid of them faster than you form them, you survive. And if they grow faster than you get rid of them, you form tumors and you end up dying. Biomarkers associated with fasting also go down. Oxidation, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome are all reduced during fasting. Now, some conditions are favorable to fasting. These are usually conditions associated with dietary excess, conditions that are made worse by obesity and visceral fat. One of the biggest effects we've been able to do is look at the effect on high blood pressure, which is a leading contributing cause of death and disability, which is remarkably affected by fasting, perhaps more powerfully affected than anything else available. We did a study of 174 consecutive patients with hypertension, and 174 patients were able to normalize blood pressure and eliminate the need for medication. We did a prospective study with our colleague from the Mayo Clinic. 27 patients with hypertension, 26 people were able to achieve normal blood pressure without any medication. One patient required 50% of their dose. And at 1 year, after they had left the clinic and been free living for a year, 76% of the patients still maintained a basal weight less than what their baseline was, and the majority were still normotensive without medication, which means that it is possible for highly self-selected, motivated patients to make radical diet changes, achieve and maintain health. Autoimmune diseases are diseases where your body's attacking yourself, and one of those is called psoriasis. And these conditions often respond profoundly to fasting. This patient, with a 22-year history of plaque psoriasis, experienced a remarkable resolution in just 2 weeks of fasting and eliminated the need for medication entirely. This patient with a progressive 2-year history of follicular lymphoma, which is a type of lymph cancer that's not as well responsive to conventional therapies, and this was stage 3, it had been confirmed by excisional biopsy, experienced dramatic relief with just 3 weeks of fasting. A CT scan demonstrated that the lesions had dramatically reduced in size. And in the British Medical Journal case reports, we reported 3-year and 10-year follow-ups showing complete cancer remission while eating a whole plant foods diet. Now, sometimes my colleagues have asked me, how did you get this patient to stick to a whole plant foods diet for 10 years? And I explained that I told the patient she had to stick to the diet strictly or it could be fatal, because I would track her down and kill her. And she apparently believed me because she stuck to the diet. A case series of patients with follicular lymphoma completed this year suggests that these results are not isolated or even unusual. This patient made a tremendous progress with an initial 21-day fast and then a subsequent 39-day fast on water only. In the last few years, we've been treating increasing numbers of patients experiencing residual symptoms associated with infection or vaccination from COVID-19. This paper documented the recovery from long COVID in a 72-year-old male with a 2-year history, including brain fog and fatigue, that responded in just 14 days of fasting. We also recently published a case of a long-standing vegan, but that had elevated lipoprotein a, and that reduced over 40% following just 10 days of fasting. Now that's significant because lipoprotein a is a sensitive biomarker for cardiovascular disease that up until now was thought to be completely untreatable. Now, to ensure a safe and effective fasting experience, it's important that a person be a good candidate for fasting. Not everybody's a good candidate for prolonged fasting. And you determine that with a medical history, a physical exam, and appropriate lab testing. Appropriate monitoring must be provided during fasting to prevent dehydration and depletion. And it's important that the refeeding process after fasting be done carefully. It takes about half the length of a fast to recover from fasting, and that's important to avoid post-fasting edema or potentially fatal refeeding syndrome. At the TrueNorth Health Center, we recommend exclusively before fasting a whole plant food diet, and after fasting indefinitely that people eat a whole plant food diet. If you are struggling with the diseases of dietary excess, perhaps fasting can save your life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your knowledge and your expertise and your presentation. Would you mind to sit down for a little chat before we go and have our lunch? Some people were asking about being skinny and fasting, because you spoke a lot about the benefits to the visceral fat. What about the skinny people?
Well, you know, what's interesting is you can be underweight but over fat. So sometimes even thin people still maintain relatively high percent visceral fat and body fat, even though they may not be statistically overweight. And you can also have problems even if you don't have fat. Not everything is caused by fat and visceral fat. As I mentioned, there are some conditions that are profoundly influenced by how much extra weight you carry. And those happen to be the most common causes of death and disability today, because 76% of people in the United States, and I'm sure it's increasing here, are overweight or obese. The fact is, if you're not overweight today, you're actually abnormal statistically.
What was your personal story that led you to fasting? Were you ever obese or overweight?
You know, I was very fortunate. I got started when I was 16 years old. just as a young kid, I was trying to be a better basketball player than my friend, Doug Lyle. And he was better, and I no matter how much I practiced, it didn't seem like I could beat him. And I read some books trying to get an edge. And one of the books was by a guy named Herbert Shelton, who said that health had causes, just like disease has causes, and that the cause of health was healthful living, and that healthful living meant you had to deal with diet, sleep, and exercise. And he talked about fasting as a way of undoing the consequences of dietary excess. And I thought, that makes a lot of sense. That's the diet for me. That's what I was going to try, and I thought it would give me an edge so I could beat him. But the problem is I'm 66 years old. He's 66 years old. He still beats me to this day because he adopted the same kind of diet. I should not have shared the information with him.
But you did start early, right?
Well, yeah, it got me early, so I never really had any health issues or problems. And I had decided at that age that I was going to pursue this information. I was actually inspired by my uncle, who was a medical doctor. And I remember it was at my 16th birthday, my family had a party for me. And I decided to share with my family. I had decided on my career path that I was going to go into this alternative medicine. And my uncle said, no, I wasn't going into alternative medicine because nobody in our family would go to a doctor like that, let alone become a doctor like that. He said, better I should be a Russian spy.
Oh my God.
So he was upset. My dad afterwards, he took me aside. He was a pretty serious guy. He never said too much, but he said, son, I don't know anything about this alternative medicine, but anything that makes him that angry and mad, it can't be bad. He said, just stick to your guns and good luck to you. And so I pursued that, and that's really all I've done my entire life. I've spent 50 years helping people go through fasting and make these dietary changes. And it's a little bit like being in the twilight zone because I get to do something that most physicians never get to experience, and that's see people actually get well.
Did anybody of your family join you in the end?
Say again?
Did anybody from your family, your dad, did they, join you in the bandwagon?
Well, interestingly, my dad ended up becoming one of my first patients. He was having TIAs, which are transient ischemic attacks, when I had gotten out of school. And he had actually had to retire from teaching. He couldn't remember the name of his grandkids. He was really in bad shape. Came in, he fasted for 26 days. Fortunately, had a great result. 20 years later, he helped edit our first book, The Pleasure Trap. And he did very well. He lived a long life, so that was good.
Is 36 hours fasting effective?
Well, even what we recommend that everybody do is not eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed. And that's going to give you 12 hours of fasting every day.
Yeah.
Now, in people trying to lose weight, sometimes they might extend that another 4 hours, do some exercise in the morning, and that would give you a 16-hour fast every day, an 8-hour feeding window. Some people find that's helpful at minimizing overeating, and that even that little bit of fasting, cumulatively, day after day, is thought to have benefit. But a longer period of fasting has a geometric impact on some of these cardiometabolic markers.
Do we need longer night fasting as we age, as we grow older?
A lot of the problem with aging isn't just the aging process, it's the accumulation of dietary excess and lack of adequate exercise and lack of sleep, as we learned about this morning. And so aging itself can be profoundly slowed down but not stopped. And one of the ways you can do that besides diet, sleep, and exercise is daily fasting for 12 to 16 hours and occasionally longer periods of fasting in an environment of rest.
How often, someone is asking, and for how long should we fast? You said that we should be doing a little bit of fasting basically every day.
I think everybody should fast every day. Now, the duration and the frequency of longer fasting really is independent on the individual biology. And so that's where history exam lab and monitoring is useful to give people guidance about duration, because it'll range in our clinic from 5 to 40 days.
And would you then recommend for people to not consult any doctors, any clinics, would just decide to be fasting for 8 days in a row on their own? Or would that be extremely dangerous.
Whether they fast on their own or they fast in a clinic, it still requires history exam lab monitoring in order to determine is a person a good candidate to monitor them through the fast, and they still need to be careful in recovery and refeeding. There's a lot of things people can do on their own. Some things are better than others. For example, everybody can do intermittent fasting for 12 to 16 hours because it doesn't require modification of medications or altering their patterns, whereas longer-term fasting does. You do not fast on medications. You don't long-term fasting on medications. You don't do long-term fasting where you're driving or putting yourself under physiological stress. So it is a situation that needs to be done in a controlled setting. Again, whether it's at home with the help of your physician locally or if it's at a clinic like the TrueNorth Health Center.
Does it make sense? Is it enough to fast 1 day a week? If you eat like you do 6 days, everything, and then 1 day a week, you just have water.
The disadvantage of fasting between 16 hours and the 2 or 3 days that people talk about is the most expensive period of fasting biologically is that period between 16 hours and when you go into full ketosis, which is maybe 48 hours. And so you have a higher mobilization of lean tissue during that time. So it's really, from a biological viewpoint, makes more sense to do daily, shorter periods of fasting than occasionally that longer fasting. You fast as long as necessary, but hopefully no more. The idea is not to try to set a record fasting, but to use enough to resolve what the underlying issues are. The problem today is even people that think they're healthy because they're asymptomatic, when you actually evaluate them, they're not healthy. Many of them have altered cardiometabolic risk factors, blood pressure issues, blood sugar issues. They may not have acute pain and debility, but they're not actually healthy. We even had a study we did to look at the effect on healthy people of fasting, and what we found was that as helpful as fasting is in sick people, percentage-wise, the changes that occur in healthy people that use fasting preventatively is actually larger. That the people that get the most benefit of fasting are actually healthy people that are using it preventatively. Instead of waiting until you have cardiometabolic disease or diabetes, actually fasting preventatively requires shorter intervention and bigger impacts over a shorter period of time.
You didn't speak in your presentation about women specifically, but I know that, for example, there are methods in which women are advised to calculate, to coordinate the fasting time with their menstrual cycle and the hormones, and it is more beneficial to be fasting, at a certain point. Do you have data on that?
Well, the fact is that women have problems that men don't experience. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, uterine fibroid tumors, fibrocystic breast disease, dysmenorrhea, menorrhagia. These conditions are unique to women because they have a different hormonal cycle. And one of the concerns that happens in women is estradiol, the active estrogen hormone, is supposed to be broken down to something called estriol and excreted in the urine. Yeah. And what makes that happen are the microbiome, the type of organisms that live in your gut and your liver function. Because people are on high-fat, high-sodium, high-sugar diets, they have disruptions of their microbiome. It doesn't work properly. The estradiol accumulates. They get these problems. And so the benefit of fasting is it can actually reboot that gut microbiome, those 1,000 organisms, the strains of organisms that live in the gut. And so some of the conditions that are most responsive to long-term fasting are actually these conditions common to women. And also, sometimes women, their plumbing is good, the tubes are good, but they're still having trouble inducing pregnancy because of these other subtle imbalances. We found that many of those women, after fasting, actually, and rebooting the system, so to speak, are actually able to induce pregnancy, for example.
Is there a connection between fertility or infertility and fasting?
There's some causes of infertility can be impacted by fasting, but others, because there's mechanical issues or structural issues, are not going to always be responsive. So, depending on what the cause is.
We did get many questions, actually. They're really good, a really educated audience. We will not be able to do all of them, I think. But there are some practical tips that people ask and want to know. How do you reduce headache during fasting, which typically starts after initial half of the day when I'm not eating?
Okay, so headache is a very common cause of problems, and you'll see a lot of it early in fasting because it's not actually the fasting that causes the headaches, it's the withdrawal of caffeine. Caffeine is a highly addictive nervous system stimulant, and when you stop caffeine, one of the many negative effects is cephalgia or headache. What we do before fasting is we have people wean down and get rid of a lot of these addictive drugs like caffeine, alcohol, cocaine, etc., so that when they go on the fast, they've already gone through that withdrawal impact. The other thing about fasting is that the withdrawal symptoms, for example, when you stop nicotine, you also get pretty severe symptoms. But by the end of the second day of fasting, there's virtually no craving for most people, because those processes are sped up during fasting. So fasting can make it much easier to help people transition from their addictions, whether it be drugs or the addictions to the chemicals we put in our food that make us fat, sick, and miserable, the salt, the oil, and the sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not actually food. They're hyperconcentrated components of food added back to food to stimulate dopamine in our brain to make food taste better. And that's what tasting better actually means, is it means it stimulates more dopamine in your brain.
How about fasting in physical activity? If you go and do your fasting for 8 days, for example, do you advise and recommend to also do exercise?
The problem is you don't do exercise when you're fasting. If you do exercise, people say, won't you lose more weight? And yes, you'll lose more weight, but that weight will not be fat. It'll be muscle. Because when you increase activity, after 48 hours, you've used your glycogen stores. The only place the body can get the glucose needed to maintain that extra activity is through gluconeogenesis, the breakdown of protein. So one of the reasons why our patients preferentially mobilize fat and visceral fat is we have them rest when they're fasting. Now, it's not complete bed rest. They're still able to do a little yoga, a little stretching. They're able to move around.
Have a little walk.
But they're very, very gentle. Not enough to increase aerobic activity, because we're trying to preserve their lean tissue, maximize fat loss, and counterintuitively, resting during fasting maximizes fat loss and minimizes protein loss.
Do we need, I think we have covered that a little, do we need a special preparation to start fasting, and how many days per month or per year would be beneficial to do?
So the pre-fasting period can make fasting dramatically safer and more effective. But what we get people doing is eating fruits, vegetables only for a couple days. No meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, sugar, no coffee, no drugs. And you wean them down to that before you begin fasting. And so you need to have a person stabilized. Then you introduce fasting. Fasting can then be a much less intense and miserable process.
A lady is asking, if I have a type 1 diabetes, is it safe for me to try fasting?
No. In type 1 diabetes, you don't make insulin because the islets of Langerhans and the pancreas have been destroyed. There's two things that commonly destroy those islets. One are there are some viruses people can get as children that will do that. But the most common cause is an autoimmune response to dairy proteins. People that are genetically vulnerable, that are given cow milk or milk products as a youngster, can develop an autoimmune response where their own immune system destroys their islet cells, and then they have type 1 diabetes. You need some insulin in order to adapt to the fasting process. So type 1 diabetics, we would do a modified program that would not include water-only fasting. Type 2 diabetics have enough insulin, and insulin resistance is reduced in fasting, and about 80% of those type 2 diabetics can achieve normal blood sugar without any medication if they're willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well and exercise, go to bed on time, and use fasting appropriately.
And when we say water-only fasting, someone just wants to double-check whether that really means no coffee.
It means absolutely no coffee or any other addictive drugs. It also means not only water, but purified water. So people that are fasting become very sensitive. If you try to give them municipal water with chlorine and hydrogenated hydrocarbon, they'll reject it. They don't like it. So we actually use laboratory-grade distilled water in our facility. And so that means water only for the entire duration of fasting.
No coffee, not even black coffee, nothing. Let's see. Did you want to add the coffee comment? Because I know some clinics in Lithuania where they do fasting, but they do allow black coffee. I don't know why.
There's all kinds of people that do all kinds of things. You can go on the internet and hear all kinds of stuff. You know, we've done this for 40 years. We've had 25,000 people. We've published fasting safety studies. The protocol we use and that we describe in our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, has been shown to be safe and effective. And I would vehemently encourage you to avoid caffeine if you're talking about long-term fasting.
Would you agree that there is, I mean, I understand that you started doing this way before it was cool to be fasting, but would you agree that there is a hype now, a mania, fasting.
Yeah, I've gone from being a criminal quack to a cutting-edge researcher because we're doing the same thing we've done for 40 years, but now fasting has gained some interest. And I think the reason why there's so much interest in it is people are suffering so much as a consequence of dietary excess fat and visceral fat, and it's really the one thing that works consistently and predictably, and we've been able to prove it. We've published 20 articles in the peer-reviewed literature, and we have this book that summarizes the results of our original research.
Is it possible to overhydrate while fasting?
Yes. Excess water can flush out your sodium, an essential electrolyte, and so we're ensure people get enough water, but not too much. That's where we monitor their urine and specific gravity to make sure that we keep them in balance. There's a minimum of about 40 ounces a day, or a little over a liter a day of water that's necessary, but too much isn't necessarily a good thing either.
And could overhydration break my fasting?
Yeah, overhydration could lead to electrolyte imbalance. It could be very, very serious. That's why we monitor people during fasting, not just physically twice a day, but we're also monitoring their blood and urine.
I think we're nearly done. There's a difficult one, though. I'm going to try to do it. Given the strong interest in fasting as a health intervention, do you think the hype has outpaced the molecular evidence?
Well, the research on long-term fasting is limited. We've actually been involved in a significant percentage of the work that's been done on long-term water fasting, and I can tell you that what we know is very small compared to what we would like to know. So there needs to be huge amounts of research, and I do think that people using fasting irresponsibly can be a problem. That's why we wrote the book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? Not just to educate people about how to do fasting properly, but to educate their physicians. And I think that's important. It's been written in a way that we've cited the scientific literature to the satisfaction of most physicians, but it's written in a way that people can understand it.
Is there any research, I know that there is, but maybe you would know more about this, done on people who spent time in concentration camps and were forced to fast?
Well, there's a little bit difference between fasting in an environment of support and sitting in a situation like that, but it is interesting to look at people that have gone through severe deprivation, including even just the population in England during the war with rationing and all that, and how much reduction in cardiovascular disease and other things it resulted as a consequence of eliminating the cause of much of the problems that we suffer from today, which is the inflammation that comes from the visceral fat, that comes from the excess fat, that comes from dietary excess.
This is all very interesting. We would have to break because we would need to go for lunch, but I was wondering, what do we do with lunch now after we've had this conversation? What is your advice?
I would advocate that people eat a whole plant food diet, so fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and minimize the use of meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar.
Forever.
We ask patients to do it for 50 years, because we do 50-year tracking. After 50 years, they're on their own.
Okay, so we will go and eat whole grain food, no alcohol, no coffee, no dessert.
I tell patients there's a really simple way to tell if you should have something or not. Just close your eyes and go in yourself and get very quiet and ask yourself, do I really, really, really want whatever it is? And if the answer is truly yes, you can't have it. You get nothing.
Shall we do that meditation exercise now? Shall we? Let's try. So what do we ask people? Let's close our eyes and think about what we really want to have for lunch. And then when we know we do, or we want, we don't have it, right?
That's right.
Oh my God. Okay, thank you. I hope everyone has had a moment. If they have sub-questions or any other fasting advice, can they approach you during
They can not
lunch?
only approach me here, but they can call me at the TrueNorth Health Center. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. And in fact, if you go in and fill out your registration forms on our website, we offer a free phone conversation to kind of point people in the right direction. I'd be happy to talk to any of you.
Who are your main clients? What would you say? How would you define the majority of your clients? Are
We
women,
see
men,
people of
older,
all
younger?
ages. About 15% come from foreign countries. Most of them are out of area from our location. We treat lots of people with high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and lymphoma, but we also have a lot of healthy people that are deciding to stay healthy. I have people that I've worked with for 30 years. Every year they've done their fast. And what's interesting, they were in their 50s, now in their 80s. They've outlived everybody they know, sometimes including their kids. And my mother was famous when she was 92. She'd outlived all of her friends doing this. And she said, Alan, you have to warn your patients, if they're going to do this diet, make younger friends.
Is she still alive?
No, she did pass at 93. But she said that it became more difficult at the end of her life making friends because all of the people, even 10 or 15 years younger, were too old to do the things she liked to do.
I feel you, and I also want to share because I did have a grandmother who recently died. She was nearly 96. She ate everything. Lots of sugar, lots of grease, but she did spend 10 years in the concentration camp. And maybe that was, her, in the end, a recipe to a healthier life. There is research that backs it up, a little bit of it, but these are interesting conversations, and I hope and I'm sure that they will continue during our fasting break. Okay, thank you. Alan Goldhamer was with us.